Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're creating a discovery guide for a truly remarkable book, Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. We're going to unpack the core ideas that made this story so powerful and hopefully help you decide if it's one you need to experience for yourself.
Okay, let's start right here. This single sentence, something Tara Westover's father told her over and over, pretty much built her entire reality. It's about a family, the Weavers, at a place called Ruby Ridge. In her dad's version of the story, the government attacked them just for homeschooling. For a little kid like Tara, this wasn't just some tale, it was a warning. It's why her family always had head-for-the-hills bags packed, ready for a war they truly believed was coming for them.
And this is where it gets really interesting. On the left, you've got the story Tara grew up with. You know, these brave freedom fighters, a boy shot just for trying to find food, a mother killed holding her baby. But then years later, she's at a university and she stumbles upon the historical record on the right. And whoa, the standoff, it actually started over illegal firearms. The father, Randy Weaver, was a white supremacist. Now, the government's actions were heavily condemned, for sure, but the reason for the whole thing was completely different from the myth that had defined her entire world.
And that battle, right there, that clash between the reality she inherited and the truth she discovered, that is the engine driving this entire book. It's this struggle between the world your family gives you and the world you find for yourself. To really get it, we're going to break it all down into 3 huge takeaways.
So, takeaway number 1 is this powerful idea of education as self-creation. For Tara, going to school wasn't about acing tests or memorizing facts. It wasn't about just learning stuff. It was about learning how to see. It was this messy, often painful process of building a brand new self almost from the ground up.
And this basically maps out that whole journey. You start with the inherited world. For her, that's her family's mountain. A tiny, closed circle totally defined by her dad's stories. Then comes the first encounter. That moment when an outside idea, like learning about the Holocaust for the very first time, pierces that bubble. That leads to this massive perspective shift. All of a sudden, she's seeing her old world from the outside, kind of like an astronaut looking down at Earth. And finally, a new self starts to form, as that old reality just dissolves into a much bigger, way more complicated world.
All right, let's get into our second takeaway, because this process of self-creation, well, it wasn't some happy-go-lucky story of enlightenment. Not at all. As it says right here, gaining a new world means you might just have to risk your first one.
Because this new world, this new self that she was building, it came at an absolutely devastating cost. The whole point is that to gain this incredible new perspective,
You have to risk losing your first one. Every single history book she read, every new idea she started to accept, felt like she was betraying her family. To become this new person, she had to let go of the old one, and that meant letting go of her home, her sense of belonging, and the people she loved more than anything.
I mean, this quote from the book just lays out that impossible choice. She realizes that him, her father, and her new educated self, simply cannot exist in the same future. It's almost like she learned a new language, this language of history, of philosophy. It let her think thoughts that just didn't exist back on the mountain, creating this gap that was impossible to cross.
And that leads us to our third and final takeaway, the battle for your own history. This is about so much more than just facts. It's about power. It's about who gets to decide what is real, who gets to be the historian of your life. This timeline really breaks down how a memory would evolve in her family. First, something violent or traumatic happens. But then, the family creates its own story, a kind of collective denial. Nope, it never happened that way. For Tara, that led to years of crippling self-doubt, literally feeling like she was going crazy. Finally, you get to the fight to prove her own memory was real against the family's gaslighting. It's like you're the only witness to a crime that everyone else has agreed to forget, and your sanity depends on you holding on to what you know is true.
So where does all this leave us? Well, it brings us to the book's big, provocative question, the one that ties everything together, the self-creation, the loss, the fight for memory. The question is, what even is an education really?
And Westover doesn't hand you an easy answer. As she says, you could call this new self a lot of things. Transformation? Sure. But also falsity, betrayal. Her point is that this whole journey, this confusing, painful, but ultimately liberating process, that is what it means to be educated.
And in the very last line of the book, she gives her own answer. I call it an education. And then she just leaves us with that question, turning the whole idea of the book right back onto us. It's an invitation to think, for sure. But more than that, it's an invitation to go pick up the book and discover this incredible, challenging story for yourself.